Abortion, immigration, guns, queer rights, Trump, Biden. If you are exhausted and hopeless just listening to this list and wondering, is there some way to have a reasonable conversation with someone on the other side of these issues? Then stick around and stay to the end when I offer 2 tips of how to deal with a situation if things get emotional or you feel yourself firing up. So let's start with some tips for actually how to have these conversations. And number 1 is to shift your purpose. So if your purpose is to persuade the other side that you are right and they are wrong, chances are you are not going to have a great conversation. I think for many of us, because we think of debate, we think, oh, when I'm in a conversation with someone who has the wrong answer on a view that I think is really important, I should spend all of my time trying to get them to agree with me, or at the very least, that they don't understand the issue as well as they did. But if you go in with that purpose, chances are one of you is going to get really upset and it's going to blow up. So what should your purpose be then? So a really good purpose for a conversation on an issue like queer rights or abortion or critical race theory is to move from persuasion to learning how the other person sees it and learning more about why you see things the way you do. So when we shift the conversation from a persuasive negotiation to a learning conversation, this offers us an opportunity to actually share how we're seeing things, including all of the data and reasoning and why it matters to us. But it also gives us an opportunity to actually learn. It also has this really added benefit, which is it lowers the stakes of the conversation. Because if I go into a learning conversation, the key indicator of success is what did I learn and what did they learn? When I go into a conversation where my goal is to prove I'm right and you're wrong, then if I don't prove myself right, then I have lost. This conversation has been a net negative for me. So related to this, and really, really hard to do, but if I'm going to go into a conversation where I know or think the other side sees an issue really differently from me, I need to spend some time putting myself into the shoes of that other person. So imagining the world from their perspective. Let me give you a current and real life example. I have a dear family member who, unlike me, is opposed to taking the COVID vaccine. And so he has resisted, and just 4 days ago, he ultimately got COVID. And to my great surprise, a few days ago, he actually took Paxlovid. Well, why did that surprise me? Well, it turns out that the vaccines now have full FDA approval, but Paxlovid is still under emergency use authorization. And from my perspective, this family member of mine has acted really inconsistently. Because if part of your reason for not taking a particular drug, in this case the vaccine, is based on the idea that this is experimental, then why did you take something that was even more experimental? But part of what I need to do to engage a conversation with him is to say, there's something here that I'm missing, because I know this family member is a thoughtful person. He's actually quite well read. He doesn't act rushly or without thought. And so somehow trying to understand what it is he's read, how he's seen it, sets me up for a different kind of conversation with him. One where we're probably unlikely to agree, but actually one that was productive insofar as we came to this agreement, which is neither of us are experts in science. Both of us are therefore reading a wide set of information. In this case, most of that information suggests the vaccine is a good idea, but some of it suggests that it isn't and that actually all of the pro-vaccine is a setup, and that ultimately what each of us has chosen to do is to put our faith or belief in one of the two arguments. Actually, that was pretty productive for me, and I also think for him. Now, our last really important piece here, right, is if you're going to engage in one of these conversations, you need to be prepared to do a lot of active listening, and active listening with the purpose of understanding where the other side is coming from, and also with the purpose of demonstrating that understanding to the other side. So I've already done a few videos on active listening, right? But 3 important pieces here. One is when they say things, even things you disagree with, just paraphrasing or like reflecting that back to them. 2, and this is how you learn more through active listening, a lot of open-ended questions. How did you arrive at that decision? What other exceptions are there? And then 3rd, acknowledging any kind of emotion that may come up from them. And so this leads me then to talk about this possibility, right, which is what happens if the conversation becomes really emotional. How do I handle that? So I want to give 2 tips on that. First, consider naming your own feelings without blaming them. So in other words, if you say something like,
"You're making me so angry right now,"
that probably will just make them defensive, because you are suggesting that what they are doing is done with the intentionality of making you angry. Instead, you might be able to say, when I hear you say that X, Y, and Z, I often feel angry, frustrated, worried, and lost. You're not saying they're doing it purposefully, but you are naming the feelings. And what we have learned from research is just giving voices to the feelings actually helps you from becoming extremely emotional. So I want to distinguish becoming emotional from sharing feelings. The second important tip here is one that I have deployed in much of the difficult conversations facilitation work that I do professionally. And it's to lower the consequences of taking a break. So when I'm going into a conversation, let's say with someone who doesn't see eye to eye with me on guns or on abortion or on LGBTQ rights, at the beginning of that conversation, I'll say, there's a high likelihood that one or both of us might get really emotional here. And so why don't we just do this up front? If that's happening, let's just agree to say, can we take a little break? Breaks are helpful. Breaks are good. What do you think about that? When I do that up front in a conversation, it becomes less of a big deal if later in the conversation I suggest a break. It's not me being weak or saying something's wrong with them. It's simply saying, hey, we have a process norm we agreed to, and let's use it now. And so any way to lower the consequences of doing that makes a lot of sense. When I'm facilitating these conversations, I'll say, chances are this is going to get really rough at moments. At that moment, I or anyone else should just say, let's take 15 minutes, or let's take a half an hour, or let's come back another day and continue. The reality is all of us can improve on how we have these really hard conversations across lines of difference. We don't just have to walk away hopelessly or raise our voices or bite our lips and say nothing. So I want to encourage you to try to actually have one of these conversations with someone in your life where you don't see eye to eye. And to do so, remember these 4 tips. 1, shift your purpose. Don't make it persuasion, make it learning. 2, before you go into that conversation, do all you can to put yourself in the shoes of the other person. What does their world look like, and why might they have the views that they have? 3, active listen. Active listen as much as you can, especially in those moments when what you want to do is fight back. And if you find yourself getting emotional or they're getting emotional, consider naming those emotions explicitly and clearly, but not blaming them for it. And make sure that when you've set the conversation up, you've lowered the consequences of taking a break. And lastly, I'd be super grateful if you would hit the button, ring the bell, and subscribe to this channel. Of course, you want to keep learning more, so watch this next video, which is how does political polarization lead to gridlock in Congress? Okay, click, click, click. Keep watching.